Will the real 300 please stand up? I'd like to thank all of my new subscribers that have joined in the last couple of days since my appearance on John the Son of Thunder. Thank you very much. It would help a lot if you'd subscribe and share these videos to get my message out there. Today I wanted to talk about 300. I want to talk about the popular rendition of the 300 of Sparta. And I want to compare that to another 300 that's lesser known that maybe a lot of us have forgot about in the Bible, in the book of Judges, Gideon and the 300. So I'm going to start this comparison by comparing the two central figures of each story. So the 300 of Sparta, the central figure is King Leonidas. In the story of Gideon, it's Gideon, obviously. So the differences between the two is that Leonidas is a king, he's a ruler of his country. One of the rulers. Sparta always had two kings. Gideon was the least son of a poor family. So there's a contrast right there. The difference in the number of 300 is actually kind of interesting too, because if you've seen the movie 300, which is loosely based off of actual fact and history, Leonidas left Sparta with 300 men and went to Thermopylae to put up his stand there. But when he got there, he was joined by another 4,500 soldiers from Athens and other parts of Greece. So it wasn't really 300, it was more like 5,000. In the story of Gideon, he left Judah, or Israel, I guess, with 32,000 men. And God at one point said to him, you know, this is too many. This is too many men to go up against the Midianites, who was their enemy, who had something like, I think it was 160,000 men camped in a valley. God wanted everybody in Israel to know that it was His power and His power alone that saved them, not by sheer numbers. So the first thing he asked Gideon was to ask all of the men, any of them who were afraid could turn back and go home. 20,000 men turned back. So that left 12,000 men. And they continued on. And God said, this is still too many. I want this to be known that this is by God's power. So he told Gideon to test them when they stopped for water. That those who went down on their hands and knees and basically stuck their face in the water and drank, versus those who go down on one knee and collect water with their hand and put it to their mouth. And so the men that went down on their hands and knees and stuck their head in the water to drink dropped their weapons. They dropped their shields and everything. And the men that went down on one knee and put water from their mouth to their hand were still holding on to a spear while they were doing it. So there's a little bit of symbology there showing that these men were ready no matter what. So after that little test, all that was left was 300 men. So God had decided that He was going to use 300 men to defeat 130,000. Again, you flip that around to Thermopylae, where there's, started out as 300 but ended up as 5,000 against, 100,000 men as well. So roughly a similar kind of comparison there. The other interesting comparison that's a contrast as well is that at Thermopylae, the Spartans defended a narrow passageway, which makes defending the passage of the enemy very easy. So they could put their men deep and very short across in their formation, so they could withstand and defend that position for a long time. And I think they did for 2 or 3 days. But with Gideon and his 300, it was a little different. They surrounded the enemy with 300 men. Can you imagine that? God asked Gideon to divide his men into 3 companies of 100 each. So now they weren't just 300 men standing together anymore. They were split up, and they went and surrounded the enemy in the dark. So this is a contrast. At Thermopylae, they're defending a narrow passageway. At the battle with the Midianites, the 300 men surrounded the enemy. They were asked to take up clay pitchers and torches and trumpets. They didn't once, I don't think they once drew a sword at the initial outbreak, but at the command of Gideon, they smashed the clay pots and blew on the horns and lit up the torches, and this freaked out the Midianites so bad they thought that they were surrounded by a huge host of men that they started to panic and flee. And so the Gideon and his men pursued and slayed many. Actually, they slayed each other at first, the Midianites. They were so confused, they didn't know what was going on. It was dark, there's bright lights everywhere, lots of noise. They started killing each other because they didn't know who the enemy was. And when they started figuring things out, they started to be routed. The Gideon and his men pursued them and kept on slaying them, slayed 2 of their princes and then 2 of their kings, and so on and so forth. So the contrast between that and Sparta was that Leonidas and his men, and all, though it was the 300 that stood at the very end, and the rest of the men from Athens and whatnot turned back, or a lot of them did, they all died. They were crushed eventually by the King Xerxes from, is it Syria? I can't remember. It'll come to me after this video. So all those men died in Sparta, but Gideon's 300 men, not one of them died, and they didn't even raise a sword until all of those men were routed. So I thought this was an interesting comparison between 2 famous 300s in history. One of them being the Spartans, who all died, and the other being Gideon and his 300 men, with God's power, defeating an entire army of 130,000 men without even barely lifting a sword. I think that's pretty darn cool. That is in the book of Judges. It's the same book where Samson, the story of Samson is. I can't remember the exact chapters. I think it's like chapter 6 to chapter 8 or something like that is the story of Gideon, who was one of the judges of Israel. Very cool. Read it in the Bible or look it up. There may even be a movie of it. I haven't seen it. But yeah, who was the real badass here? Was it these tough Hollywood Spartans that we kind of, you see it in the movie and you get this sense of, oh yeah, these guys are real tough dudes, and all that, but really, these 300 men that were following Gideon and following God, they had to put their faith in God that this was all going to work out, or they were going to get just slaughtered. I think their level of fear must have been right up there. They had to keep that under control and in check, and have a tremendous amount of faith in God to pull that off. So I would say, personally, that the 300 of Gideon were 100 times more badass than the Spartans. Even though the power of the victory was through God, these men were men, like real men. Like, if you actually put them against the Spartans, I think they would probably actually be tougher. So I thought that would be a little treat video today for all of my new subscribers and friends out there. A little bit of an inspiration, though we are small, we are a remnant, we have God with us. And 300 men can slay an army of 130,000 with God's power. Then what can we do in this day and age with all of the technology that we got and even more numbers? What can we do with our prayers and with our efforts? God bless. Catholic Northman, out.